Hello, good morning, good morning, good morning. If you're watching this live, please bung live in the comments and please put replay in the comments if you're watching this on replay. Let me know where you're watching from, say hello, and hopefully I should see those comments come through. Also, as we go through, if you've got any questions or anything at all that you want to ask as we go along, bung those in the comments as well, and I will answer them as I go. Or I will answer them at the end if I think they need a little bit more time and consideration. But definitely get some of that interaction going. Let me know that you're watching because I do love to have a chat with you folks while I'm doing these. If this is your first time kind of joining, I'm doing these live streams once a month on various topics around stress management, well-being, people leadership, personal leadership, and all of that kind of thing. And this is one of the ones that I've been particularly excited about doing because the area of the I frame and the S frame, which I will share with you what that actually means if you're not aware. It's something which really fascinates me from a kind of organizational leadership perspective, also from a public policy perspective as well, because you see this kind of stuff borne out in society as well. Melanie, hello, live from Dorset, lovely stuff, not too far away from me in, I would say, sunny Devon, but if it's anything like it is here in Dorset, it's certainly not sunny. We haven't got any snow though. We've only got just heavy rain. So it's not even fun. It's not even a kind of fun precipitation. So yeah, the I frame and the S frame are kind of borne out in various ways in society. And as we kind of go through this presentation, this talk, this stuff that I want to share with you, you'll probably understand or at least be able to think of specific examples of where you've seen this in the past. And I'll share with you some examples as well. Hey, Francesca, just seen that you're watching from Bath as well. So is the Southwest crew. Got Devon, Dorset, Bath so far. Anyone else going to join us who is not in the Southwest? Let's see what's going on. For those of you who don't know me as well, my name's Jay Onwin. I am a stress management speaker and strategist. I've been working in wellbeing and fitness for the last 10 years, over 10 years, in fact, mostly at an individual level and more recently at an organizational level, which kind of ties in with the topic of today's stuff. So I deliver talks and workshops and consultancy to organizations who want their people to be able to manage stress more effectively and therefore have a better quality of life as a result. And I'm going to share with you a little flowchart that I've been working on, a kind of causal diagram that I've been working on. It's not completely finished yet, but towards the end of this, I'll share that with you. It'll be a kind of first look, but I will be sharing it more and more over the coming weeks to really explain how stress and effective stress management affects quality of life in a very visual way, and also where the interventions can be made both at an individual level and a systemic level. So first off, I'm going to share with you what the I frame and the S frame actually are. And then following that, we're going to be having a look at why the kind of current focus tends to be on the I frame and why that is maybe not the most effective, but why companies tend to lean in that direction, why society tends to lean in that direction. It's an interesting chat in itself. And then we're going to look at how we can actually go about improving outcomes and improving kind of stress management from a leadership perspective in the organization. Should we be looking at the I frame? Should we be looking at the S frame? So to start with, most public policy, when looking at behavior change in the population, has looked at what's called the I frame. And this is the individual level interventions. And the S frame is the systemic level interventions. So if we use an example of kind of public health, there are certain systemic issues around public health to do with status, inequality, isolation, food environment, various things like that, which are all systemic, right? They're not to do with individual behaviors, and they're not to do with individual beliefs and actions and stuff like that. But the I-frame factors around that are things like personal behaviors, or they're to do with biases as well. Like we've all got bias, right? We've all got bias based on our kind of upbringings and our experiences up to this point. And that's kind of an I-frame characteristic, of I-frame factor, self-interest and things like that. And more recently, you will see a lot of the interventions which are being posited by government and kind of public health bodies and things like that focus on individual behaviours. So there was a big focus on something called nudging and the nudge theory. David Cameron was a big proponent of this before he became Prime Minister back whenever it was. When did he become Prime Minister? 2010. So prior to that, I think he did a TED talk about it as well, about this nudge theory, where you're kind of nudging people's behaviors through various means to improve things. And a lot of the stuff that's kind of been built in terms of trying to change people's behaviors around health and well-being at a population level have been about these individual nudges. The problem is that all of the research that the nudge theory was based on, everything that was published in the scientific journals around that kind of behavior, was shown to have a quite significant amount of publication bias. So there was, I don't want to say it was cherry-picked data necessarily, but there was definite publication bias. And last year, so very recently, there was an analysis of all of the evidence for nudge theory as a behavior change mechanism. And they accounted for that publication bias, and they found that when that bias was accounted for, it had basically no effect. So this nudge behavior thing, which a lot of things are based on at a kind of public health level, doesn't actually work. Now, it's important to understand why that actually is. And in order to do that, we kind of need to look at kind of more historical factors and stuff like that. Before we go on to that, I think a good way of understanding I-frame versus S-frame is that the S-frame is the rules of the game. The systemic stuff is the rules of the game. And then the I-frame is very much focused around taking the fallible players of the game, i.e. us as human beings, the players of the game, and helping them to play the game better. But the systemic stuff, the S-frame, is the rules of the game. So anything that we as individuals do, we have to do within the parameters of the game that we're playing. Now, if we want to have a massive change in things, we're going to need to address the rules of the game, surely. We've got to look at the rules of the game that we're playing, rather than just trying to get people to play the game better, because the choices that are available to us are limited. Yes, there is personal choice. Yes, there is personal agency, but we can only pick from what's in front of us. Some of us are more privileged than others and therefore have more choices available to us, and then other people have less privilege and have less choices available to them. So we might be able to say, oh, you should be making these kinds of decisions because it's good for your health, but it's like, yeah, that's great, but what if those choices aren't available to me? What if you're in an area where the availability of food is lower, or quality unprocessed food and stuff like that is lower, or it's more expensive and that's not accessible, either physically accessible or financially accessible? Then the rules of the game need to be changed, because there's not the choice there. It's an illusion of choice. An example of an intervention where they've kind of looked at both sides of this is with smoking. When in the UK they brought in the smoking ban, that's systemic. That's a systemic change. When you look at increasing taxes and duty on tobacco products, that is a systemic change. It's making it less accessible to people. It's changing the rules of the game, essentially. Now, the I-frame stuff, the nudge stuff, is putting those gruesome images on the packets of cigarettes to try and nudge people's behaviors and make it less of an appealing choice. Those things can be really useful as well, potentially, but that in its own right, just putting those labels on, I mean, how many people do you know that still smoke that do so because even though there's those pictures on the cigarettes? They just don't look at them. People have become immune to those things. They don't even look at those pictures. They're just blinkers on. They don't see them. They just pick up the cigarettes and they smoke them, because it's not about the picture. It's about the rules of the game. The biggest argument for individual level interventions, I-frame interventions, is the argument around personal freedoms. So individual liberties, and saying, well, if we change the system, if we change the rules of the game, then people don't have the freedom to choose anymore, and we're imposing what we think is right or wrong on an entire population. If you outlawed smoking entirely, if you made it a complete ban, it was illegal to smoke tobacco products, then you would be infringing on people's liberties to do what they want with their bodies, right? And that's the argument, and that's a valid argument as well. If you ban them in public places due to, for example, the argument around passive smoking and the fact it has a detrimental impact on other people, there's arguments which can be made there, because it's like, you're still free to do whatever you want, but not where it will impact other people in a public place who don't have, the choice to be around you or not be around you. In your own home, do whatever you like. So there's a balance there. And with the smoking thing in the UK, they took systemic level interventions and individual level interventions and try and kind of amalgamate the two for an overall end goal of reducing the number of people who are smoking and therefore the health impacts of that. Now, the argument around personal liberties, personal freedoms, individual liberties, that has been lauded by corporations and governments and stuff as well, because, and this may be the cynic in me, now I agree that there should be personal freedoms and you should have the ability to kind of do what you want with your body and that personal sovereignty. But are companies really caring about that? Are governments really, is that really their motivation, or are they using that to cloud the real reason, which is that there's a lot of money in being able to sell these products? So, for example, the tobacco lobby, for a long time, stifled the publication of data around the health implications of smoking, of course. Now, are there other lobbies which are saying, yeah, actually, do you know what we're going to do is say, oh, it's up to the individual, and we're going to promote these individual level choices and behaviors and empowerment and educating people, but really we're not going to change the rules of the game. You see this with green energy, and you see it with kind of oil companies and stuff like that. It's saying, well, we've got all this stuff available, but is there really a choice there, or is that the illusion of choice? Say, well, people should be able to choose whether they want an electric car or a petrol car, or people should be able to choose whether they go to a provider of electricity for their home, which is a green provider versus a coal-fired provider. If that choice is there, then people will choose whatever's more important to them. But then there's also these factors like availability, and there's factors such as affordability and stuff like that. So is it really money that's kind of calling the shots here rather than that individual choice thing? It's like, actually, how do we get the most money out of people? Maybe that's the cynic in me, but we've got to look at all of these kind of different factors. And I think that a lot of the reason why governments and organizations are saying, it's individual choice is because that then shirks their own responsibility. Now, if we take this and we put it into the context of well-being in an organization, we put it into the context of a company, let's say, of 500 people, and the bosses at the top of this company want to improve the well-being of their people for whatever reasons that might be. Maybe they genuinely care about their people. I am not cynical about that. I'm quite optimistic about that. I think most people do care about other people. Most leaders do care about the people in their organization. I strongly believe that. But also the financial implications of that. If you've got a more fit, well workforce, they're more productive, they have less days off, they're more loyal, they're more likely to stick around. You've got lower costs associated with absenteeism, presenteeism, staff churn, and all of those things. Then you want your team to look after themselves. But a lot of the focus that I've seen working in these kind of areas for the past few years is on individual choice once again. So there's a lot of stuff around workshops and seminars and talks that are focused around what can individuals do to improve their well-being? What can individuals do to improve their management of stress? What can individuals do rather than what can organizations do? I've delivered plenty of those things as well. And I think that they are important and they play a part. But I've become a little bit disillusioned with it because the problem that I've seen is that on the organization side of things, the responsibility isn't being taken as seriously. So leadership have an idea, and this is not a malicious idea, but it's a blinkered idea that individual well-being is an individual responsibility, and that's where it stops. Now, the individual responsibility for well-being is absolutely a thing. My well-being is my responsibility, nobody else's. But there are things outside my control which affect my well-being, and to ignore that is naive at best, and at worst, it is deliberate and malicious. But even at best, it's naive. So if you're a leader in an organization and you're looking at your team and you're saying, well, why don't you just do X, Y, Z? That's naive. That's naive to think that everyone has 100% control over their well-being. That is not the case. That is just not reality. Ideally, in an ideal world, maybe that would be the case, but it's not. We are affected by other people's decisions. We're affected by the environment that we're in. We're affected by chance. All of these things are outside our control. Now, some of these things which are outside our control are within the control of the people in leadership positions in the company. So this is where I kind of share my answer to this. Is it the I frame we should be looking at? Is it the S frame we should be looking at? Well, it's both. Quite clearly, it is both, because both factors play a part. It is not all individual action that makes the difference, but it's also not all systemic environmental stuff which makes the difference, because you could change the environment completely, and if someone's behavior doesn't change, then the outcomes don't change. Sometimes you could change the environment and by default people's behaviors will change, which we have seen. We have seen that throughout history. In fact, I'm going to draw out, there's a really interesting article, a really interesting paper that looks at this from a kind of public policy perspective by Nick Chater and George Lowenstein. And I'll share this in the comments, I'll share a link to it in the comments. It's a really interesting paper, which I don't believe has been published in print yet, but it was accepted a few months ago as a manuscript, and it's available online. And it's called The I-Frame and the S-Frame, How Focusing on Individual Level Solutions Has Led Behavioural Public Policy Astray. And interestingly, Chater and Lowenstein were very big supporters of individual level interventions for a long time, until they realized the error of this. And this paper is about that realization. So they're not coming at this from an ideological perspective, they're coming at it from a, hey, we were wrong. And that is a powerful position to be coming from. And I thought this quote really sums up nicely the idea of, or it deconstructs the idea that individual choice is the thing which makes the biggest difference. This little quote: seeing individual cognitive limitations as the source of society's problems. So cognitive limitations meaning people's choices or people's discipline, people's motivation, and the choices that we make as individuals, and that limitation that we have to make better choices. Seeing individual cognitive limitations as the source of society's problems is like seeing human physiological limitations as the key to the problems of malnutrition or lack of shelter. Okay, I'm going to say that again and we'll deconstruct it a little bit. Seeing individual cognitive limitations as the source of society's problems is like seeing human physical limitations as the key to the problems of malnutrition or lack of shelter. So saying, hey, it's your behavior and it's the way you think about things and it's your motivation and your discipline and your willpower and your ability to choose which is causing the problems of various health crises within the population, or various well-being crises and mental health pandemic that we hear about all the time, and all of these things, that's because of your inability to make better choices. It's like saying the reason we have societal problems with malnutrition at various places around the world is because those individuals are limited physiologically and they should need less food. Or the lack of shelter that people have on homelessness is because you as an individual should be improved upon and therefore not need that shelter. Do you see how this makes no sense? In order to fix those problems, we need systemic level interventions. In order to fix problems like malnutrition, lack of shelter, we need systemic level interventions. And therefore, when we're looking at the psychological side of things and we want to address issues around mental health and well-being, or overall well-being, physical as well, and quality of life and all of these kinds of things, stress management in the workplace, we need to, rather than going, hey, you're just not resilient enough, we need to look at the systemic level stuff and say, right, how can we change the environment? Because history, and then here's another little quote from the same paper, history shows that the solution to individual frailty is to change the system, not to enhance the individual. Change the system, not enhance the individual. And this has happened throughout history. And we look at the things which have come up throughout history which have improved society as a whole, is usually systemic level interventions. And you can look at legal frameworks, and you can look at political frameworks, and you can look at public health initiatives, and you look at vaccination programs, and all of these things, when you look at them, have been systemic level interventions which have changed things for the better. They've improved health outcomes, they've improved quality of life overall, not because you've said to people, you're too frail and you need to be improved and enhanced and made better, but actually, do you know what, we need to change the environment so that it is more supportive of those good outcomes that we want. The big challenge here is that a lot of power lays in the hands of the people who want the focus to be on individual action. You look at companies who are trying to, organizations who are trying to reduce plastic pollution, and there's a lot of focus on using less plastic in the home, buying less plastic packaged stuff, zero waste shops, recycling. They're all individual level actions. What about systemic level actions, such as banning single-use plastics full stop? That would surely make a bigger difference than individual action. Of course it would. We know this. But what the problem is that a lot of the money rests in the hands of the organisations who benefit from using single-use plastics. There's so many examples of these, so many examples of these things, and the onus keeps being pushed back onto the individual action. You need to do this, you need to do that, you need to change the way you run your household. And it's tiny changes, and of course those tiny changes will add up, but not to the point where the threshold is met to improve the overall outcomes. So we need to look at both sides of things. I'm not saying that everything needs to be systemic, but what I am saying is that if we don't address both sides, then the impact is limited. So we're going to do about 5 minutes more on this, and then I'll take any questions and stuff like that. So if you're watching this and you've got any questions about anything I've shared, or you've got any comments about anything I've shared, any ideas or any examples of times when this has happened, or things which are going on currently in the kind of political landscape that you think may be examples of this kind of focus on iframe solutions rather than systemic level solutions. If you've got any examples of that, drop those in the comments as well. I'd love to address them. Now I'm going to share something really quickly. Let me just make this. Okay, what am I getting? How do I share something on here? Let's see. See, this is the first time I've done a sharey thing on here. I'm just going to share with you this diagram that I was saying about. Okay, so this is the diagram I was saying about stress and quality of life. So if you're a leader in an organization or if you're an individual, this is my approach. Now, this diagram will be refined as things go along. This is where I'm at the moment. And as you can see, the kind of that central column there, you've got external stressors. Stresses are things which cause stress. So those external stresses, which could be your workload, your finances, your relationships, things outside of you, that feeds into your overall level of external stress. So the overall pressure and tension exerted on you by all of these different stresses comes together, and the overall amount of that is your external stress. That external stress will trigger internal stresses. So the stress responses in your body, so that may be psychological or physiological. So a biological stress response like fight, flight, freeze kind of thing, or psychological stress, strain, anxiety, and worry, and all of those things. So there's these internal stresses happen internally as a result, which feeds into that overall level of stress that you have internally. And that level of stress impacts your overall quality of life. It's one of the biggest indicators, if not the biggest indicator of your quality of life, is the amount of stress that you're under and how you're dealing with that. So that's kind of that pillar down the middle where external stresses and stress, you can see they're kind of grouped together. So you've got the external feeding into the internal, which feeds into your quality of life. Okay, that's kind of how a very oversimplified version of how stress is affecting your quality of life. And if you look on the left and on the right, you've got individual interventions and systemic interventions, and you've got three of each, and they feed into the exact same points of this chain. At the top, arguably the most important, environment engineering, both from an individual perspective and from a systemic perspective. So if you're an individual, you have some control over your environment. You have a choice of what's around you. You have a choice of the relationships that you have to a degree. You have a choice of what your home is like. There's various things you have choices around. But there are certain things you don't have choices around, such as your workload. You may have some impact on that, but the amount of work you are given is usually a result of someone outside of you choosing what you have to do. That's just the nature of employment. And also the environment that you work in, not just workload, but the environment you work in, the management styles and leadership styles, the relationships you have at work, and so on and so forth, is still part of that external environment and features those external stresses. So there are systemic interventions which can be done by the people who control the environment. That is you, if you are a leader of a team. It could be a leader of 3 people, it could be a leader of 30 people, 300, 3,000 people, it doesn't matter. Whoever you're responsible for, you have an impact on the environment that they're in from a working perspective. Now, if you are looking at relationships, you have an impact in terms of the environment that your children or your spouse or partner live in, or there's various things that we have impact in with other people. Okay, and that's that understanding that we are a collective. We are not individuals, which are no person is an island, right? We're all affected by other people's stuff. And so understanding that where we can control that at a systemic level, especially if we're in a leadership position, is vital. So by engineering our environment, our own environment, and the environment of the people in our care, we are limiting the external stresses. We are turning down some of those taps that are flowing into that stress bucket. We're turning some of those off if possible, but we're turning others down. So there is less pressure, there is less overall stress, strain, and tension from an external perspective on that individual or on that group of people. The next kind of place is where that external stress triggers internal stressors. You've got individual coping strategies, of course, and you've got those right down at the bottom where the internal stress affects quality of life. So there are certain things we can do, way more stuff than I can go into at this point in terms of coping strategies, but we hear about this a lot around stress management. In fact, this is where we tend to see the word stress management deployed more than any other time. It's when we're talking about individual coping strategies for stress. That's only one part of the picture, right? But it's important, and we can manage the way that external stress affects us and how we respond to it. And then we can manage how that internal stress then affects our quality of life. There are certain things we can do to limit those things. But also education, training, support at a systemic level to help people have better coping strategies. Now, individuals are very much focused around those coping strategies. How can I manage my stress better? Organizations and government bodies and stuff are very much focused around education and training and support and saying, how can we teach you how to manage your stress better? The bit which is being left out is that bit at the top of engineering the environment and saying, well, how can we go further upstream in this flow chart and go, well, let's reduce the stress level in the first place, both as an individual and as an organization, as a system. And this is where I think more of the work needs to be done. If we look at systems going, okay, how can we engineer people's environments to be more conducive to well-being, we're going to have a much better outcome at the bottom. And that quality of life, of course, will then lead on to greater business successes as well. It will improve the bottom line of an organization if more people in that organization have a better quality of life. They'll be more productive, they'll be more loyal, they'll be happier, their morale will be higher, there'll be greater collaboration, there'll be less absenteeism, less presenteeism, less staff churn, and the costs associated with those will be lower. So this benefits everyone. This is not a win-lose. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a win-win. The problem is not that someone has to lose out in this scenario. The problem is the perception of how to go about it, and the perception that somehow spending money or investing in these kinds of strategies, this kind of consultancy, would limit the productivity of the business, because really we need to drive forward and we need to push people hard and we need to increase stress. I will say at this point, stress is not inherently a bad thing. There needs to be a certain amount of stress. It just needs to be managed well. Management does not mean reduction to zero or as close to zero as possible. Management means management. It means control. It means adjustment based on feedback. Okay, so management doesn't mean removal of stress. It means exactly that, management of stress. Okay, so it's not about getting it to zero, it's about getting it to a level where it's in the sweet spot that we can move forward, and it pushes people to do better and to improve their own quality of life as well as other people's, because some tension is good, but we manage it in a way which doesn't cause the burnouts, the mental and psychological injuries and illnesses, the physical illnesses and injuries as a result of overload of stress. So hopefully this kind of makes more sense. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, if you don't already, make sure you follow me. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you will see more and more of me sharing this, and it may evolve over time, and I may add little bits to it, and it will become a kind of foundational piece of what I do when I go into organizations and I speak to people about stress management. From now on, as well, I'm making it a big priority of mine. If I'm going and delivering a workshop on stress management, I will not only do a workshop just to the people on the shop floor. I will do it comes as a package. You have a leadership training as well, because the leaders need to understand their side of this. They need to understand the systemic interventions. They need to, I just realized I've got my screen up here and I'm putting this here. I'm pointing in the wrong direction for everyone who's watching. People need to understand the systemic interventions and how we can improve the lot of the people. So I'm not doing it anymore where it's just a case of focusing on individual interactions and interventions. It's just not, that's not enough, and it's putting the pressure in the wrong place, and it's making people feel guilty and feel bad for making decisions which they don't really want to be making, but they're kind of being steered towards by the nature of the environment they're in. Francesca, I've just seen you've got to go. That's all good. We're wrapping up now anyway. So I mean, I'm going to just clear that off the screen now. If you're interested in this stuff, then you need to try and follow me. If you don't already follow me, then make sure you do. If you already follow me, then please hit that notifications bell so you can see when my stuff comes up, because this stuff is important, right? It's being talked about more and more, but I still don't think it's being talked about in the right way. If you think this has been useful, then please share this with someone that works in a leadership team. Please share it with someone who works in public health, public policy. Share it with whoever you think will benefit from learning about how systemic interventions and individual interventions can work in tandem to improve the overall outcomes, rather than just picking that individual level thing. If you've watched this on a replay, please bung some questions in the comments as well, because I can answer them, even though obviously the live is finishing now. I can answer them in the comments as well. Tomorrow I will be putting up a link for next month's topic, so keep an eye out for that as well. Next month we'll be doing another live stream on another topic. Hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully it's cleared some stuff up around these different interventions, and it hasn't confused anything. Hopefully it's made a bit more sense, and it's something that you can take forward and use in your own life, and also in your leadership role. Thank you so much for watching. Big love to all of you. Hope you have an amazing Wednesday and a great rest of the week. Look forward to chatting to you a bit more. If you want to drop me a message on LinkedIn, please do. I'm always happy to chat more about this stuff. And if you've got any questions about how I can help in your organisation, drop me a message. Let's set up a call. No hard sell, nothing like that. But I can share with you some ideas about how maybe a few areas that you're going wrong at the moment and how to get better outcomes. Okay, brilliant stuff, guys. Have a great one and see you soon.